Assalamu alaikum. Thank you for joining. A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. In the name of Allah, the most compassionate, the most merciful. Verily, our praise is due to Allah. We praise Him, we seek His aid, and we ask for His forgiveness. We seek refuge in Allah from the evils of our own selves and from the evils of our own actions. And whomsoever Allah guides, none can misguide. And whomsoever Allah leaves astray, none can guide back to the correct path. Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wa ashhadu anna Muhammadan abduhu wa rasuluhu sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. We testify there is no deity worthy of our worship except for Allah, who is alone, with no partner, never has and never will be another. And we bear witness that Muhammad, peace and blessing be upon him, is the last and the final prophet of Allah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu, my brothers and sisters, friends and family, those tuning in to the live stream and listening to after the recording. Jazakallah khairan. Thank you all for joining in for our Monday halaqah and discussion regarding and continuing the reading of the book, The Ethics of Disagreements in Islam, written by Taha, Jabir, Alalwani. If we are continuing since the previous week, we completed chapter 6, and now we're getting into chapter 7, chapter 6, going over the juristic principles or perspectives, where many of the main bodies and methodologies of schools of thoughts, madhabs, there we go, how they were able to come up with their rulings and the reasons as to how they came to the decisions of which they did, depending on which school of thought they derived from. Now we're getting into chapter 7, which is the reason for those sorts of differences and intellectual issues. Without further ado, let us begin. Bismillah. So differences of opinion on intellectual issues, and by extension on juristic ones as well, are natural on account of inherent disparities in intelligence, understanding, and analytic capacity with which people are created. And if we accept that this statement is valid, then we must also accept that differences of opinion between several companions during the time of the Prophet ﷺ and the rightly guided Khulafa did occur, and these have been well documented. And we would be doing a disservice to this religion if we denied this phenomena. And by the same token, we do not regard an open discussion of these differences as detracting from the purity of the Islamic message or from the sincere intention of those companions who had differences. And indeed, we can say that in mentioning these differences openly, we are in fact testifying to the objective reality and validity of the Islamic religion. It's the point that we are able to come together as one, bring our arguments, and come with a conclusion at the end, just as two scientists would be able to do so. So natural differences, of course, occur. Islam treats people on the basis that they are human beings who, because of a variety of factors, they are often at variance with the naturally pure state of which they are created, which is comforting to the believer. However, is that the differences of opinion among the companions did not spring from weakness in belief or aqidah or any skepticism as to the truth of the Prophet ﷺ's teaching. Instead, they resulted from a genuine desire to ascertain the truth through patient investigation and discover the purpose of the lawgiver. So as long as the Prophet ﷺ was the source of these laws, we find that no disagreement lasted longer than it took to refer it to him. And from what we have said above about earlier Muslim history, we can also say that the causes of differences in opinion in most cases hinge from the linguistic or juristic interpretation of Quranic text and the interpretation of the Sunnah of the Prophet. And there were certainly no hidden malicious motives behind these differences, much to the disappointment of the hypocrites who were bent on sowing the seeds of discord in the community. And this accounts for the ease and the speed in which these differences dissipated as soon as the disputants met the Prophet ﷺ, or as soon as a relevant text was produced by anyone. And from the companions' attitudes, we can see the soundness of the saying that one who possesses a sound natural disposition, the fitra, supports truth wherever he finds it. And it is to be expected that some differences and the reasons behind them should have been passed on from one age to another. There is no way of restricting these differences to a given period. However, with this rapid spread of Islam after the demise of the Prophet ﷺ, there surfaced new and more critical issues in the Islamic sphere, which have in turn contributed to the spirit of disagreement. So regarding a historical context and points, we're going to fast forward into time and go after the assassination of the third Khalifa. So in particular, since the assassination of the third Khalifa, Uthman ibn Affan, the new regions to which Islam had spread were exposed to violent agitations, and this imparted a new and completely alien dimension of the previously staid religion of differences of opinion. The atmosphere of political agitation and uncertainty impelled people of every city and town to become more protective of whatever knowledge of the Prophet ﷺ sunnah that they had, and they were weary of attempts to corrupt and fabricate different traditions. And the cities of Kufa and Basra emerged as centers of intellectual activity, and they provided a fertile ground for the exchange of political ideas and the proliferation of various sects, such as the Khawarij, the Shia, the Murji'ah, as well as the Mu'tazila, the Jahamiyyah, and other speculative and deviant groups. And at this time, there were as many intellectual and rationalist tendencies as there were groups, with each group formulating its own methods and principles for interpreting the text of the Quran and the Sunnah, and for dealing with new controversies as they came up. And there was a pressing need to put in place some controls for regulating the situation, for specifying the methodologies that could be used for deriving positive laws from the divine revelation, and for specifying what was allowed and what was not in the conduct of controversies. So fortunately, the very principle of allowing differences of approach in the matter of jurisprudence, or fiqh, as we know, fiqh meaning the application of that law, was generally accepted. These were matters of detail and required to begin with a highly specialized knowledge of evidence from the Quran and the Sunnah. And the word fiqh literally means understanding. By extension, it is used to denote the particular understandings which a jurist, or faqih, literally one who understands, brings to certain issues. And the word fiqh also refers to the body of knowledge, rulings, and judgments which come from a jurist's understanding of issues in the light of clearly defined principles. So on the basis of knowledge available to him or her, the jurist may pronounce a judgment which may actually conform to what the lawgiver intends, or it may not. Whatever the outcome, he is not required to do more than exert the utmost of his intellectual effort to arrive at a judgment. It is likely that his judgment may coincide with the purpose of the lawgiver, or be as close as possible in it to essence, purpose, and effect. And given this approach, difference of opinion was therefore regarded as legitimate, provided it fulfilled two types of conditions. The first being that each disputant must have evidence or proof, or dalil, to authenticate their argument. A failure to produce such evidence would invalidate the argument. You can't just go off of prose or off of one's thoughts and whims or desires. It has to have relevance and proof. And second, being the adoption of a divergent opinion should not lead to anything preposterous or false. If the opinion is manifestly false from the beginning, then it should be abandoned straight away. And these two conditions illustrate the difference between ikhtilaf, which suggests a justifiable difference of opinion, and khilaf, which is more akin to discord. Ikhtilaf presumes that sincere intellectual effort is exerted to arrive at and to a judgment, and on the whole, it represents an objective methodology. And khilaf, on the other hand, departs from one or both conditions mentioned above, and it is the manifestation of impulsiveness and obstinacy, and it has no lead to objectively attempting to come to the truth. And the jurists whose schools of thoughts were variously adopted by the Ummah as a whole adhered steadfastly to the two conditions mentioned above. So providing necessary evidence to authenticate an argument and abandoning any position that was patently preposterous. And legal historians are not at all unanimous in specifying the causes of the juristic differences in that period, in spite of the vast literature on the theme. The causes, nevertheless, could be attributed to three main factors. One being linguistic factors. So, and again, we're going through the reasons for differences. First being linguistic factors. Second being factors pertaining to the transmission of hadith. I'm coming blank on the word. Isnad. And third, the factors pertaining to the principles and the rules of deduction. So first, let us delve into the linguistic causes. So a single word in the Quranic text or hadith may have several different meanings. The word ayn, for example, can mean an organ of sight, usually referring to the eye. It could mean running water, pure gold, or a spy. And if such a word is used in a context where it's difficult to say precisely what it means, even the scholars who try hard may give variant meanings of a word or expression which can be sustained by the text. And meanings may also be suggested which are totally at odds with the intended meaning of the word. And a case in point is the disagreement among jurists as to the true meaning of the word qura in the verse Surah 2, Ayat 228. And the divorced women shall undergo without remarrying a period of 3 qura'u. And the word qur'a or qura'u in its plurality can either mean menstruation or the purity following menstruation. And the actual length of the waiting period can thus vary depending on which meaning is adopted. Even if this small amount of time, or even a few days, if you will, counts, it can lead to some disagreements. And some jurists from the Hijaz concluded that the waiting period should be 3 intervals of purity, while the jurists from Iraq concluded that it should be calculated on the 3 occurrences of menstruation, which could mean a shorter waiting period. And sometimes an expression can have both a literal and a figurative meaning. This was, however, disagreement among some scholars on whether, in fact, it was all appropriate that Quranic expressions should have figurative meanings. Most scholars confirmed that it was appropriate, while a few, like Abu Ishaq, Isfarayani, and Ibn Taymiyyah, rejected such a possibility. Pardon me. And those who did not agree that a Quranic expression might have figurative connotations agreed that such connotation had no real bearing on the original usage of the word. So accordingly, the word lion, for example, cannot be taken to mean a brave man. They argued that the Quranic text came to clarify laws and not to confuse them, as figurative interpretations would tend to do. Our purpose here is not to debate this issue. The majority of scholars, as we have said, were of the opinion that figurative connotations of the Quranic text were admissible. And Ibn Qudama and other jurists, in fact, considered the rejection of figurative connotations as a mark of obstinacy. Nonetheless, here, excuse me, scholars in studying Quranic texts did differ in their understanding of the purpose of the lawgiver. And if a word suggested two interpretations, some scholars opted for the literal meaning and some for a figurative meaning. And the word mizan, for an example, literally refers to a scale or an instrument for weighing things. And figuratively, it may have the connotation of justice, as in these verses, Surah 55, ayat 7 through 9. And the firmament, which he had raised high, and he has set up the balance, the mizan, in order that you may not transgress the balance, so establish weight with justice and fall not short in the balance. And in its last occurrence, the word mizan above has the literal meaning of a scale used to weigh goods. And in its first and second occurrences in the word mizan may signify justice or adl or balance in the following verse as well, in 57:25. We have sent our messengers with all evidence of this truth, and through them we bestowed revelation from on high and the balance, mizan, is referenced here, so that mankind might behave with equity. So figurative speech is also to be found in the overall context of a Quranic passage, as in the verse in Surah 7, ayat 26, children of Adam, we have set down anzalna on you clothes to cover your nakedness and a thing of beauty. And the word anzalna literally means we have sent down. And of course, clothes were not sent down from the sky as clothes. A literal understanding of anzalna is therefore inadmissible. And anzalna may instead be taken to mean we have bestowed the knowledge of making or using something. And this meaning would fit other occurrences of the verb anzalna in the Quran, as when Allah SWT said in 57, ayat 25, he bestowed the knowledge of making or using anzalna, I'm mispronouncing this, anzala of iron. And we cannot translate this literally as and God sent down iron. And another possible explanation of Allah sending down clothes is that Allah sent down the rain and caused plants to grow. He also created animals with wool and fur and hair, and from these we make our clothes. And hence the verse may refer to the finished product as a manifestation of Allah SWT bounty, rather than the original water which he sent down, which is described elsewhere in the Quran as the source of every living thing. And apart from the meaning of the individual word, linguistic difficulties arose over questions in grammar. It is a common knowledge that a direct imperative of a verb, for example, do, often indicates a command to fulfill an obligation, and the negative imperative, don't do, indicates prohibition. And these imperative forms, however, are not always used in this absolute sense. And the direct imperative form of a verb may be used, for an example, to indicate a commendable course of action, to offer guidance, to give a warning, or to convey some news, such as in 24:33, the command to write out a deed of freedom for any enslaved person requesting such a deed is taken by scholars either as an absolute command, which has the aim of the abolition of slavery as a social institution and as indicating a commendable course of action, and the command to the believers who give or take credit to, in Surah 2, ayat 282, set it down in writing, is regarded as offering guidance and advice. And the command addressed to those who deliberately turn away from the prophetic message to, in as mentioned in 41.5. Do what you will is generally regarded as a warning against the consequences of obstinacy. And apart from direct prohibition, the negative imperative may be used to encourage abstinence from acts which are improper or disliked, to offer guidance, or to convey some news. So when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions, in 1588, so turn not your eyes longingly towards the worldly benefits which we have granted to some of those that deny the truth. The negative imperative, turn not your eyes, is taken to encourage abstinence from a potentially distressing attitude. And when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commands the believers, as mentioned in Surah 5, Ayat 101, do not ask about matters which, if they are made manifest to you in terms of law, might cause you hardship. This is taken as offering guidance in avoiding undesirable curiosity. And the varying ways of interpreting both positive and negative commands have contributed to differences among the jurists in their approaches and in their methods of deriving laws from the text of the Quran. And some scholars may be at variance on the contextual use of words, even if they fully agree upon the meaning of the words. And a case in point is the differences over the Quranic verse, Surah 2, Ayat 282, which deals with the role of the scribe and the witness in the recording of business transaction, which is mentioned to be the longest Quranic verse, ironically. And one interpretation based on the reading of Ibn Abbas, radiyallahu anhu, gives the meaning of the verse, and let neither scribe nor witness cause harm, meaning, this interpretation takes the verb as being grammatically in the active voice. The scribe is taken to be guilty of writing something different from what had been dictated to him, and the witness guilty of giving false testimony. And another interpretation based upon the reading of Ibn Mas'ud, radiyallahu anhu, gives the meaning of the verse as, and let neither scribe nor witness suffer harm. And this interpretation takes the verb to be grammatically in the passive voice. Both the scribe and the witness may have harm done to them if they were forced to write or testify at the time when it was convenient for them to do so. So harm could also come to a scribe and a witness, for an example, by being held responsible for the eventual consequences of a contract as such, or for the non-fulfillment of any of its provisions by either of the contracting parties. And those who are interested in investigating such causes for differences in opinion will find many examples in individual words and in grammatical constructions. And according to these differences, a text might be regarded, for example, as either general or specific, absolute or limited, summing up or clarifying. And our brief treatment of the subject here may encourage the reader to study these fascinating linguistic roots of juristic differences and the specialized works available. But I think even in this case, the fact that we are able to still go back about the one in particular Quran, then we are that further relates our authenticity regarding the Quranic revelation. But next is regarding the differences over the hadith. Most of the juristic differences among the early scholars can be traced back to the narrations of sayings attributed to the Prophet ﷺ. Sometimes a hadith never reached a certain scholar, and so he might formulate his judgment according to the explicit meaning of a Quranic text or another hadith that was available to him. And alternatively, he may resort to qiyas, coming up with his own rational reasoning from a relevant judgment made by the Prophet ﷺ, or would have recourse to the presumed continuation, istisab, of a law not known to have been revoked where the circumstances were available. Or he might base his judgment on the principle of not burdening people with some obligation when there is no textual evidence to warrant it, or in some other accepted principle of reaching a judgment through ijtihad. So sometimes, in actual fact, a different hadith from that available to one scholar would reach another scholar, and this would result in different judgments on the same issues. And at other times, a jurist may receive a hadith which he considers to be defective, thus preventing him from using it for making a legal ruling. And the following are some possibilities in this regard, which are mentioned as 3. First and foremost, the chain of narration, or the isnad, going back to the Prophet ﷺ, may not be sound and may include a narrator who is obscure or untrustworthy, or whose memory is weak or defective, which then would make it less reliable or not reliable at all, really. The isnad, or the chain of narration, again, may be interrupted. So maybe there's a break in this chain, so we don't know where it's coming from. And that is to say, the narrator did not cite the first authority who had heard the hadith from the Prophet, which may be, in fact, the most important, because that's the first link in the chain. And third, the jurist, especially in the case of hadith reported by a single narrator, may oppose certain conditions for probability of a narrator which others do not impose. So his conclusions and his judgments on these particular issues may therefore differ from those of others. And the conclusions and judgments of scholars also differed according to their individual conceptions and definitions of the actual text and implications of certain hadith. For example, they differed on the meaning of certain technical terms in some hadith, such terms as al-muzabayna, al-mukhabara, and al-muhaqala, and al-mulamasa, and al-munabadad, and al-gharar. And occasionally there might be, and I apologize if anybody knows the words I'm referring to and I'm butchering them, they have it written in English here. Occasionally there may be textual variations in versions of the same hadith to the extent that a key word might be missing from one text, or the entire meaning of the hadith may change because of this missing word. And furthermore, some scholars might receive a hadith which had a consistent internal meaning, whereby it was possible to get a good understanding of its intended sense. Others were not so fortunate, and the understanding of the hadith would be at variance with the intended sense. So differences of opinion would also occur when one narrator heard only part of a hadith, while another heard of it in its entirety, which still makes it relevant and acceptable. But the original the original text of a hadith may also be changed through misspelling, misrepresentation, or interpolation during the course of its transcription, thus resulting in divergent conclusions and judgments. And jurists might also consider a hadith to be sound, but at variance with another which he regards as more reliable, and he would naturally go by the latter. And in another situation, it may not be clear to him which of the two pieces of evidence is more reliable, and he would refrain from using either until such a time as he attains independent confirmation. And a certain jurist may come across information which abrogates a hadith or makes it more specific or limited in scope. Another would not have the benefit of such information, and this would, of course, result in differences in their own schools of thought. And lastly, before we close, the last section of differences over juristic methods. And this is the third major factor in explaining the emergence of differences of opinion. Usul al-fiqh, or sources and principles of jurisprudence of fiqh, may be defined as the science which embodies knowledge of the proofs or evidences, adillah or dalil, if you do it singular, on which jurisprudence is founded, and the methodology of making deductions from this knowledge, and the subject to which the law applies. All of the principles and rules formulated by scholars for regulating the process of ijtihad and deriving subsidiary laws of the Sharia form part of the science of usul al-fiqh. And in their various methodologies, jurists specify the basic principles which they use for formulating their laws and gave the proofs, or hujjah, for these laws. And they elaborated all the steps they took from the beginning to arrive at an eventual legal ruling. as we had gone over last week. And the scholars of various schools of thought differed in the principles and the rules which they used. For an example, admitted the rulings of the companions of the Prophet, so some, as a sound basis for making a judgment on the grounds that a companion of the Prophet, because of his moral probity, and would only give a verdict on the basis of proper evidence or proper understanding of the evidence, or on the basis of having heard a relevant statement directly from the Prophet, which they were unaware of. And others did not place such a great reliance on the rulings of the companions, choosing to go by only what the companions reported directly from the Prophet, and not their interpretations, their impressions, or actions. And some scholars adopted the principle of al-masila, al-musala, of public interest, which is neither commanded nor prohibited in any primary source, but is based on the conviction that all the laws of the Sharia are intended for realizing the welfare or the good of mankind. And others did not take this principle as a valid source of law, and this led to actual differences in formulating the laws. And there are other principles of this kind in which the scholars were at variance. They differed over the admissibility of using principles of or presumption of continuity, or adopting the more cautious route, or adopting the more lenient route, or adopting the more severe route, or customary law, or local custom. And they also differed on the implications of primary text, the methods of arriving at these implications, and what could justifiably be supported from these texts. So in this way, there arose many differences in the field of subsidiary laws. And this is a brief outline of the most important causes for juristic differences. Those who are interested in further research or in finding relevant examples to clarify the various points of differences may draw upon available works, both classical and modern, which deal with these sort of issues, and especially nowadays, that's ready and available to us, sometimes by the click of a button or the swaying of one's hand and fingers. And may Allah SWT bless all those who make the endeavors to with this sort of thirst and wanting to look into that sort of thing, so that we can be more rightfully guided, or help ourselves gain that knowledge, so that we can gain that knowledge ourselves. I mean, but with that, we come to the closing of today's reading. Jazakallah khairan, everyone who has stuck by, and mashallah, everyone that has joined us in for the Zoom meeting, inshallah. With that, just as a reminder, we do have a Monday halaqah every single Monday, a Zoom meeting that you can join us with for a discussion further afterwards, as well as other programs on Tuesday, and a halaqah on, actually we're starting a second one on Sunday now, inshallah. The new Muslim course on Saturday, and other sorts of programs as well. So we hope to see you there. And with that, we will go ahead and close. Allahumma subhanaka wa bihamdi ashhadu an la ilaha illa ant astaghfiruka wa atubu ilaik.